Have you ever had an armature just not turn out right? Well, today we're going to discuss some tips to fix that and how to build a sitting armature. As we start to say goodbye to summer and summer friends, we start seeing the new changes and a new beginning. And what better way to celebrate than starting a new project? We are going to be making a sitting doll armature today. Most of my art dolls will measure from the top of the head to tip to toe from 14 to 16 inches long. The materials that I use are pliers, wire nips, floral tape, 14 gauge, 12 gauge, 18 gauge wire, and a ruler for measurements. It is important to understand what type of gauges that you need for your doll size. Something above 14 inches needs a heavier and sturdier type of gauged wire. I am twisting 12 and 14 gauge wire together to make it as strong as possible. The 12 gauge being the strongest, I measure at 16 inches, and then I measure the 14 gauge at 14 inches. Using measurement is always the best way to start out, and of course knowing what gauge wires for what purpose. I measure my 14 gauge slightly smaller than my 12 gauge to leave a bare spot to do these hooks at the end for attachment for feet and hands. Anytime you have any excess or any little sharp points, you want to try to remove them the best you can without nipping your other wire. Okay, so this is where one big problem can happen, is when you're trying to undo something you already twisted. In this case, it wasn't such a big deal because this will be for the neck. But say for instance this was for the arms or the legs, something that you're going to move around a lot. For one thing, it's really hard to get them straight again after they've been twisted. But secondly, you're going to weaken that wire. And if it's something that you're going to be bending and manipulating quite a bit, it may cause the wire to break. So my suggestion is just to leave it as is and not undo and retwist and retwist. Just keep going and try to fix the armature in another way if the links were disproportioned. I have been making art dolls for 7 years and so I've had that happen quite a bit where they just break. After all, I know none of us want to waste the wire. It's just better to try to fix it in another way. We will talk about some of those ways in just a little bit. So we have the neck, arms, back, and legs. We just need hands and feet. I used this exact armature with Feely. Floral tape is such wonderful stuff. It helps you attach your pieces together, and it also kind of softens some of the sharper points. When you pull on it, it becomes stretchy and sticky, which can also help you when you start to wrap your fiber around. These are the feet that I'm working on here. Well, it's actually going to be the shoes. And I use 18 gauge wire for this. I started using this method by adding this separate foot like this quite a few years ago for a few reasons. And one of those reasons was if one of my legs were shorter than the other, then I could lengthen it by using this 18 gauge wire. The other reason was for the decorating of the shoes and what type of shoes I wanted. I know you're thinking, wow, that doll's got a giraffe neck. But I promise you, once you add your fiber and your wool, it'll be perfectly fine. You may not have noticed, but I'm not quite the precision type of gal. I kind of like to eyeball and wing things. And I know for some that's very frustrating and they're like, how can you do that? But over the years, I've gained experience and to learn how to correct my mistakes in other ways. And I just don't like to waste my materials, and I will force myself to use what I have. And you know what? It was okay, and the project still turned out great. I think it comes down to the curiosity in us all, for those of us who like to experiment and just to see what happens. I am sure you have noticed that this doll is going to have a very strong, sturdy neck. But that's a good thing, so you can bend it back and forth and in any way you want to pose it. So here we are using our handy dandy floral tape to do the final attachment of the neck onto the arm and to soften any little sharp points that may be still sticking out. But like I said, floral tape is great stuff. So now we have a truly robust armature for a 14 to 16 to even 18-inch doll. The sturdier the better for the longevity of the doll. You want that strength in the doll so you can pose and repose as much as possible. But just remember, the more you manipulate and bend wire, the weaker it does get. If you intend on selling your dolls, you may want to add a disclaimer stating that excessive manipulation may actually damage the doll. After all, they are art dolls and they're not categorized as a toy. They are not meant to be over manipulated. But building the best armature that you can help the longevity of the doll, just like I mentioned earlier. Here we are adding a hand. This would be a great opportunity if I were to realize that my arm was actually too short for the armature. So then I would use an extra bit of 18 gauge wire and extend the hook out with the 18 gauge wire and then attach the hand. I use 18 gauge wire for my fingers, my hands, and for my feet only when I'm making a sitting armature for an art doll. Keep in mind that 18 gauge is not a very strong wire, and when I'm using it for a sitting armature, obviously the doll is not meant to stand. It will not bear weight, so you will not be able to stand the doll if you use this method. Moving on to the feet, and another little trick that I like to use if, say for instance, one leg is a little bit shorter than the other. You can do so by adding a little bit of extra wool or by adding a couple layers of cardboard to fix the length. I think the best tip for building an armature is to learn through your mistakes and just experience the joy in the process of making. So excited to make all these friends with you. So I hope you subscribe so you don't miss out on any of the fun. Thanks so much and talk to you soon.